Hello, and welcome back to AP Environmental Science. Today we want to talk about natural selection and evolution. These are concepts that you really should have talked about in your biology class, so this is something that you should be familiar with. So we're going to do a little review about what those things mean, and then we're going to look at this through an environmental perspective. But first, let's talk a little bit about natural selection and Charles Darwin, right? Darwin wrote The Origin of the Species where he really crystallized what is happening in natural selection. Now, he is not the only person to publish. Wallace published. There were a lot of other people before him that were kind of floating around these ideas, but Darwin was able to really very clearly and logically lay out what happens in natural selection, and it's based on two principles. The first one is competition. There are more offspring born than can survive, all right? And so only those that are able to get resources, get mates, all that good stuff, are going to pass on their genes. The second part is that each of those individuals is slightly different, right? Sexually reproducing offspring are not identical, okay, because of recombination, right? You've got two parents, you've got crossing over that occurs during meiosis for the gametes, things like that, right? So it stands to reason that some of those organisms, right, some of those individuals would have traits that give them an advantage, and those traits are called adaptive traits. So, adaptation results from which of the following? Well, we can look at number 5, constant expression of genetic traits. That would be life, so that is definitely not the answer. Less fit individuals don't necessarily die off. They may just never have offspring, but they may survive just fine. The key there is offspring, okay? Individuals that have a population that are changing their traits, individuals don't change traits. Individuals have traits, and those will either work in the environment or they don't, and there is no change for a better fit. Okay, populations don't improve themselves. That's number 1. Populations don't improve themselves. They just are what they are. Adaptation is individuals with these adaptive traits surviving and producing more offspring than their competitors, right? Than all of the others within that generation of the population. That's adaptation, okay? Now, when we put these together, you can say that what we just said, organisms that are, quote, fittest are going to have more offspring. Now, the catch is you don't really have to be fittest. Oh, and by the way, Charles Darwin did not actually say survival of the fittest. It is attributed to him, but he didn't actually say it. But still, let's get back to it, right? So fittest is not really the thing. You just have to survive long enough to have successful offspring. And so not all of the genes that are passed on from generation to generation are the fittest. Sometimes they're just fit enough, and that's good enough. Okay. Now, divergence is where you have populations that split, right? And so I have a little situation here where you have this great little population. You have the green ones, they've got some traits. You have the orange ones, they've got some traits, and there is variation among those two groups. They split in their population. Now, we're looking at how does speciation work, right? And so the first phase of speciation is, well, background extinction of predators doesn't help anybody because then everybody starves to death, right? So that's not helpful. Geographic isolation, my little picture that I just showed you has a situation with geographic isolation, but you don't have to be geographically isolated to begin a speciation event. You just need to be reproductively isolated. And obviously geographic isolation results in reproductive isolation, but a mutation that might change timing of ovulation, for instance, or, pollination or whatever, that would be a reproductive isolation event. So it doesn't have to be geographic. There's all kinds of other things, right? But let's get back to our geographic example. So we've got these populations. The populations in the north, the traits that are better suited, those are going to be the ones that are going to get passed on. Same thing in the south, right? And this is how you're getting new species here. And in fact, let's say that we have this cute little bunny. This is actually a European cottontail. This is an Arctic or snowshoe hare, and this is a jackrabbit. Well, in the north, you need to have short extremities so you don't lose heat. You need to be rotund and fuzzy. Yeah, and white is really helpful because snow. In the desert, you are going to want to be brown, right? Because camouflage. But your extremities will be much more helpful if they are long, right? Because that can help dissipate heat. Now, neither of these animals got things that they needed. The environment worked with things that they had already, okay? Now, in order for natural selection to occur, which of these is true? Well, the trait does have to be heritable, okay? You can't pass something on that can't be inherited, so it has to be heritable. Uniformity, you could have one individual that has a trait, and that actually does happen, but the more offspring that come from that ancestor are going to have that trait too, and so it spreads out. So no, uniformity is not necessary. Number 4, being larger, not necessarily helpful, right? And not necessarily the way. Maybe smaller is better suited to an environment than larger. So there's not like you have to be something more than your parents. You just have to survive better than everybody else, okay? Now, the trait must lead to differential reproduction. That is what we're talking about, that it gives an edge over competitors and more offspring have those genes, okay, or that trait. All right, now, there are really two things that are going on though. We've talked about natural selection, and these are things that help these are things that are for survival, right? So natural selection is going to act on things that make individuals better suited to an environment, and then of course you have the population changes over time. These traits are going to be functional, they are going to be economical, they're going to be constructive, they are going to do something that helps the individual survive, right? Camouflage is a really good example. Awesome, yeah. Now, it's great that you survive, but you also have to get a mate. And so this is where the sexual selection comes in. And sexually selective traits are not really survival traits at all, because what you really need to do is that if you are a male and you would like to have offspring, you need to attract a female, right? And so you need to have something that impresses the ladies, right? So these traits are going to be showy, they are going to be exciting, they are probably going to require a lot of energy, and sometimes they're changeable, right? This is going to be, you know, the show. That is in direct conflict with survival most of the time. So you can think about animals that have, or plants or whatever, that have these really showy traits, actually by having those traits show that they are better able to survive with traits that are not suited. And so that actually shows an increase in fitness to the females. It's the good genes idea, yeah? Okay, so descent with modification is what we're talking about. You have a common ancestor, you have selective forces shaping those individuals and therefore populations. The genes in the population change over time. That is evolution. Now, the traits themselves, those are random. Mutations, recombinations, stuff like that, okay? Those are random. But the selective pressures are absolutely not random, okay? So, which of the following is not correct for the evolution of species through natural selection? Well, although you have occasionally a trait that will pop up, you have this punctuated kind of equilibrium, the majority of evolution happens very slowly. Natural selection is generation after generation, small changes, and then over time those lead to bigger changes, okay? The chances of adaptive traits exist when you have increasing genetic diversity. That's true. Offspring do tend to resemble their parents because they share a lot of genes, right? Selection occurs constantly, but evolution, remember, only happens if you have a change in the genes in the population, okay? If the population genes still stay kind of same, Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium situation, more or less, then you don't have evolution. Now, different species experience more or less equal rates of evolution. That is absolutely not true, because a huge part of it is going to be the time that it takes for each generation, right? So if you are a bacteria, well, that's not helpful. If you are something that has a very short lifespan, like a mouse, that's going to mean that there are going to be more changes over time than if you're something that's slower, like an elephant, yeah? Okay, so evolution, just to recap, is the change in genes in a population. Individuals do not evolve. Individuals survive to pass on their genes, but populations do evolve because over time genes can change in a population. There is no improvement in evolution. It just, you, you just have traits that are selected for or not selected for. And then there are also neutral traits. So let's keep that in mind. Not every trait is selective. Some traits just happen, right? Okay, so what we're saying in that improvement thing is that organisms don't change because they want or need things, right? You don't get a white fuzzy coat in the snow because you need it. You get it because it's selected for, because it's already in your genes, okay? So you work with what you have, right? You work with what you have. Now, there is no difference between macroevolution, and that is looking at evolution over a long period of time, say the evolution of humans, right, versus microevolution, which are small events like antibacterial resistance, right, or pesticide resistance, things like that we've talked about before. Macroevolution is a collection of these smaller events because if you think about that over time, you can get big changes based on small things, right? So, just to recap, evolution is the change in a population's genetic makeup through successive generations, okay? It's change in genes. Now, what happens though if you do not have traits that allow you to survive in a given environment? That brings us to extinction, and this right here is the passenger pigeon, okay? Now, extinction is natural, it's normal. There are about 10 species per year on average throughout, time that have gone extinct. There have been 5 great extinctions, right? Mass extinctions, and that includes the one that allowed for the rise of mammals 65 million years ago, the Cretaceous, end of the Cretaceous extinction. That was when we had the Chicxulub asteroid and all that good stuff. It's very exciting. It turns out, though, that the extinction rate right now is anywhere from 100 to 300 species per year. And so the question that we ask ourselves in environmental science is, are we in a mass extinction now, right? And the passenger pigeon didn't go extinct because it couldn't survive or get mates. It went extinct because its feathers looked pretty on hats, yeah? And so we have to kind of ask ourselves, are we responsible for a mass extinction that is occurring right now? Okay. Now, before we do that, let's talk a little bit about disturbances in ecosystems. These can be natural or they can be anthropogenic. But basically what happens is something comes in and disturbs an ecosystem, and then succession occurs, right? That's kind of like recovery, or not, as the case may be. So there are 2 types of succession. There is primary succession, where you start with bare rock, okay? And let's say that you have a volcanic event, lava covers whatever you've got going on there, and now you're down to bare rock, okay? The first thing that you're going to get in there, lichens will start growing in the rocks. They'll start breaking down the rocks. Then you get small annual plants. Then you get some perennial herbs and grasses. This is like a meadow. Then you're going to move into your grasses and shrubs, right? And so you get your shrublands. Then you can move into your shade intolerant trees. These are trees that need full sun to grow, and so they're usually smaller. And they, a lot of evergreens actually are this, but it doesn't have to be. And then you're going to move into your big shade tolerant trees and your big hardwoods. The shade intolerant trees are usually softwoods. They grow really fast. These shade tolerant trees are slow growers, okay? And so that's kind of the progression you can see over time. Over time, soil is building up, and so it allows for bigger plants. And then the animals come in and match whatever that ecosystem is. Now, not all ecosystems are going to go through succession. Secondary succession happens when you have a change, but you have the soil still remaining. So let's say that you had a mature climax community and we destroyed it. We cut it all down and did farmland. So secondary succession is going to be the most common succession that we as humans trigger, okay? Because it's not like we make volcanoes erupt and stuff like that. But a lot of times have soil left over even though we've destroyed whatever the vegetation is. Now, you're going to get the same kind of progression, except you're going to skip the bare rock lichen phase, and you're going to start with your annual plants, then you're going to move in with your grasses and perennials. So in the place of the lichens from primary succession, you have the annuals here that take root in the soil. And then after your perennial herbs, then you're going to start to get, and shrubs, then you're going to start to get those shade intolerant trees. A lot of times it's going to be these pines that start out. Then you're going to get harder woods, right? And the pines will start to die out. There'll be a little bit of competition. And then we'll get a mature oak hickory forest after, like the original one, before we cut it down. And that's secondary succession. And like I said, the animals will go with the plants. Early successional species tend to be things that live on the ground, right? And then your mid-successional species, you have things that will eat shrubbery. You don't really have a whole lot of like tree nesters because you don't have a lot of trees. Now, once you start getting trees, you can get things that live in trees. And when you start getting this good ecosystem going, you will get your mature species, and these are the big things, also your apex predators, okay? And that's how succession works. Now, this happens with ponds as well, right? Lakes and ponds, they will fill up with sediment over time and eventually turn into wetlands and then eventually turn into meadows, okay? So it's not just terrestrial, it's also aquatic ecosystems. And then I put this slide in here for you so you can kind of see what's the difference between an immature ecosystem and a mature ecosystem. Now, when we talk about succession, we really have to ask how stable is the ecosystem as to whether it's going to move back to what it was before. Now, I will tell you, a lot of ecosystems get stuck in one phase of succession. I mean, if you think about grasslands, right, the Great Plains at this time are not going to be mature oak hickory forests, no matter how long you leave them alone, because they don't have enough water to support the growth of these big trees. And so you just can't get those kinds of ecosystems. So some of them are sort of naturally paused, if you will, okay? But let's say that we go in and we disturb it for whatever reason, whatever we do. There are going to be three things that you need to think about, and it's going to be inertia, and that's the ability of the living system to resist the disturbance to begin with. There's going to be constancy, right? And that's the ability of the system to keep its numbers, right? To stay within carrying capacity and things like that. And then there's resilience, and that's how well the ecosystem can sort of bounce back, right? Resilience obviously increases with smaller disturbances. Deserts and rainforests have very low resiliences. Grasslands have a pretty high resilience, just as an example. Okay, so here's your next question. True or false? All disturbances to an ecosystem are detrimental? Well, no, they're not, right? That's false, yeah? Okay, so let's talk about human-induced selection. Yeah, how do we influence natural selection and evolution? Extinctions caused by human events will be counterbalanced by the evolution of new species. We know that new species are evolving all the time. We also know that we're causing lots of species to go extinct. Are those going to be balanced? No, they will not be. This, by the way, is a Tasmanian tiger. They are extinct. It is a marsupial apex predator. It was replaced by people and dogs, dingoes. Yeah. Okay, climate change is a huge issue in terms of natural selection because when you change the climate, you're actually changing the things, right, that are applying the selective pressures, okay? So here are just some examples. Ocean acidification, right, really does all sorts of changing of things. You have this range of tolerance, right? And you can get things outside the range of tolerance. And we've talked about that too for temperatures and stuff. But then there are other things, right? Ocean acidification also affects shell formation, right? And so here the purple sea urchin is becoming endangered because it's not forming its shells properly. They're too thin, yeah? Changing temperatures, again, like acidification, pH, you have this like just standard range of tolerance issue. But you also have issues where you have changing ranges, right? Like alpine chipmunks need a colder environment. Here's one right here, very cute. And so they are moving farther and farther and farther north. Mosquitoes in Alaska like warmer things, and so they are also moving farther and farther and farther north up the tree line as things get warmer. And so in places where there never used to be mosquitoes, there are lots of mosquitoes now, right? And then you also have predator-prey mismatch. A good example of that are the rhinoceros auklets and the anchovies. The auklets hatch, but the anchovies haven't arrived yet because the migration patterns are changing because of the changing climate, right? And that's a huge problem. And then changing precipitation patterns. We've talked about that before. Maybe you had something that was a forest, but now it's a desert. Maybe you have something that was dry and now it's moister, right? And those are all real problems, okay? Urbanization. Urbanization automatically selects for individuals that can adapt to urban conditions. This is a coyote. There's a story about this on NPR, this little coyote in Portland that is taking a ride on public transportation. Over here, right, you have a peregrine falcon who is perched on an air conditioning unit. Peregrine falcons have taken really well to high-rise buildings. They've replaced the cliffs, and so they are doing a great job making skyscrapers and high-rise apartments and things like that their homes. This is a raccoon, and we all know that raccoons are generalists. They are feisty. They are great survivors. Here you have a wolf, right, obviously in a park. This over here is a moose that is jumping over a fence in the city. And then here in the corner here, you have some little capuchins. I'm sorry, those are not capuchins. Those are macaques. So there's just some examples there. And then there's some other pressures. Pollution, obviously. It's going to select for individuals that are tolerant to whatever the pollutant is. And a really good example of that is copper-tolerant grasses around mines, right? And so a lot of mines change the soil quality. There's overexploitation. We remove genes from populations because we pick things that we think are great, right? But that takes those genes out. So hunting the most impressive males before mating season weakens the herd. Picking the biggest blooms before they fully open doesn't allow for pollination to occur, right? And we do this with roses a lot, especially. Pesticides and antibiotics, we've talked about that a million times. Invasive species, we introduce non-natives, whether they are natural species or species that we have artificially selected. We bring those all over the place. And we'll be talking about invasive species, specifically sparrows and gray squirrels later on. But a lot of times non-native species can outcompete other native species, and they don't have natural predators, and so they just take over, right? And then artificially selected species don't belong anywhere. House cats are a really good example. House cats kill millions of birds every year, right? And so they are really decimating native bird populations. And then feral hogs here in the South, in Texas and the South in the United States, are a huge, huge problem, okay? So let's talk a little bit about artificial selection. And this is the gradual improvement of an animal or plant characteristic over time for our benefit, right? Doing something that gives us a product that we want, whether it's sheep that have thick wool all year round, whether it's animals that have more meat, plants that are hardier, whatever, okay? Traditional artificial selection is the process of crossbreeding, genetic engineering, the process of breeding to change genetic characteristics of population, or cloning. Well, it's not cloning, and it's not now possible because of genetic engineering, because we've been doing it for thousands of years, right? Agriculture, we started domesticating plants about 12,000 years ago. You can crossbreed species, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're artificially selecting species. We breed to change genetic characteristics of a population, and that is artificial selection. And the textbook example is corn, right? This is teosinte. It is the progenitor of corn. These are very hard cases that don't open very well. There's not a lot of them. We have bred it until it has become this, and that is different, right? Zea mays is the binomial nomenclature for that, and it's the only one in its little group, right? Because we made it. Here is a wild turkey. Here is a domestic turkey. A lot more meat on this guy right here. As a matter of fact, they fly, but they don't fly well. Wild turkeys actually do fly. Pigeons, right? There's a nice little pigeon that happens to be rock dove, which is the pigeon you see in the cities. We make them into things that we find attractive, right? So we do all sorts of things. So it's not just because we need it to be functional, we also breed things that we think are pretty, right? But back to the functional thing, this is the wild boar, this is a domestic pig, and we use those for all sorts of things. Now, artificially selected plants and animals can be a problem because they can be problems sometimes because some of them revert back to the wild type really quickly. Sometimes they outcompete native species, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have wild predators, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have an itch in the wild, sometimes they don't. They're usually favored by us over the wild type, but that doesn't affect that in nature. But when they get released, right, feral animals or domesticated animals that have been raised in the, not raised, but they've grown up in the wild. Okay, and here's a good example. This is a feral hog, and this generations before, and not too many generations, would have been a domestic pig. Okay, so its ancestors are domestic pigs, but as they're breeding in the wild, they revert back, and I think this is the best picture ever. These are both piglets belonging to this sow right here. This is what a wild boar piglet looks like, and this is a domestic piglet. That's what they look like. And she had both of those because she is in fact domesticated. Yeah, except not anymore. She's wild now, and that's what feral is. And these guys range in population somewhere between 6 and 8 million. They are highly destructive, and they will be one of the animals we talk about when we talk about invasive species later on in this unit. All right, that is it. If you have any questions, please make sure to ask them in class. And also, don't forget that we have the shared doc where you can write questions that I will see before class. All right, thanks and have a great day.